Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and now it is time to sing. Some boys kiss me, some boys hug me. I think they're okay. If they don't give me proper credit, I just walk away. Some boys try and some boys lie, but I don't let them play. No way. Only boys that save their pennies make my rainy day. Because we are living in a material world, and I am a material girl. You know that we are living in a material world, and I am a material girl. That's Madonna's Material Girl, released 1984. And the place is Boomer America, and the time is the 1980s, where we are going to experience a Reagan Revolution? Question mark. And we're going to follow that outline right up above my little yellow box. So put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow as we compile our answer to that question there on the lower left. Evaluate the historical legacy of the baby boomers. Are they social revolutionaries who made a better, more equal, more liberated America, or spoiled, self-indulgent narcissists who ruined the prosperous country they inherited? Using the history presented here from 1960 to the present, argue from one of these two perspectives. Did the boomers save or squander the legacy of America? So, who are the boomers? Our story so far. The boomers are a generation of Americans, 76 million strong, mostly born between 1946 and 1964, during the baby boom, who share memories and experiences of growing up in the 1950s, the hippie flower power of the 1960s, the murder of John F. Kennedy, the fighting in Vietnam, the moon landings, the malaise of the 1970s, the Reagan Revolution, the Cold War, and the coming of the 21st century. They were born during a period of unrivaled prosperity. In the 1950s and 60s, the American economy tripled. Unemployment averaged 4.5%. Home ownership was widespread. And for the first time, the United States became a majority middle-class nation. During this period, there were no major wars or no major economic downturns. They had, in many ways, an idyllic childhood. There was very little hunger or want. There were stay-at-home mothers. Yet, the prosperity of the 1950s and 60s masked a series of serious problems with American society. The casual sexism and intolerance of the time, the harsh conformity of the era, the enduring problems of civil rights and racism, and the threat of atomic bombs in the shadow of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And these problems largely caused the baby boomers to grow up and reject the middle-class lifestyle of their parents. Make love, not money. They wanted nothing to do with that bourgeois middle-class aesthetic. They wanted to go to rock shows, cool music, hang out with Timothy Leary, do drugs, tune in, turn on, drop out. And sometimes they would drop out of industrial society completely, moving into the backwoods communes of the Pacific Northwest, returning to nature. But the big break between the counterculture and American society came in the 1960s, and it came with the Vietnam War. This long war, fought between 1965 and 1975, pushed the divisions in American society to the breaking point. Led by colorful characters like Abby Hoffman, there's Abby Hoffman, stick a pin in Abby Hoffman, we'll come back to him. Led by colorful characters like Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, the 1960s counterculture turned against the war. Combined with military reversals in Vietnam itself, it swayed public opinion against the Vietnam War. By 1968, the United States was committed to withdrawal from Vietnam, even though it would take an additional 5 years to do so. And deprived of American support, South Vietnam collapsed in less than 2 years, ending the Vietnam War in 1975. And even to this day, Vietnam remains the largest military defeat in American history, with 58,000 American soldiers dying in Vietnam, failing to prevent a communist takeover of that country or the horrific genocides that followed the communist victory in Southeast Asia. And all of this was accompanied by a long period of economic stagnation and decline. Massive government spending in the 1960s resulted in an inflationary cycle as the economy slowed down. This was exacerbated by Richard Nixon's fumbling attempts at price controls. The economy slowed in the 1970s. Inflation soared. Unemployment pushed past 10%, reaching levels unseen since the Great Depression. And as the economy declined, violent crime exploded across American cities. Murder, drug abuse, theft, mugging, prostitution, all of these became much more commonplace and much more public in the 1970s. American cities began to fall apart, pressed hard by economic crisis and rising crime. The middle class largely abandoned the big American cities. Whole neighborhoods became abandoned, and cities themselves began to look like bombed out ruins. And by the mid-1970s, hippie counterculture was no longer seen as harmless flower children opposed to a foreign war, but as dangerous pot farmers, burned out druggies, incomprehensible protests, murderous cult, wackadoodle communists. And all of this was taking place in a poorer America with rotting cities, rising crime, a ruined economy, and no real military, and no leadership at all. And the boomers had largely grown up. For someone born in 1948, they were 30 years old by 1978. Increasingly, they had married, they had kids. If they were lucky, they had jobs and a mortgage. The bourgeois comforts and middle-class lifestyle of their parents that they had largely rejected in the 1960s was starting to look pretty good by the 1970s, but they were also looking out of reach in the 1970s. And after the collapse of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford was selected to be president because nobody voted for Gerald Ford. Maybe Gerald Ford could do something. No, Gerald Ford could fall down a staircase. That's what Gerald Ford could do. He was only president for 2 years and made 3 major mistakes. He botched the end of the Vietnam War. He proved hopeless in the face of economic decline, especially inflation. And lastly, he pardoned Richard Nixon, an enormously unpopular move. But still, Gerald Ford somehow thought he could win re-election in 1976, and he thought wrong. Jimmy Carter won the election of 1976. It was a narrow victory, but a victory nonetheless. The winner of 1967 was Jimmy Carter, who began his presidency with a great deal of promise. Jimmy had been a nuclear engineer in the Navy and a very successful governor of Georgia. Carter wanted to be a people's president, an informal, stripped-down president, as different from Nixon as you could possibly get. Carter jogged in public, he wore jeans, he appeared in shirt sleeves, he hung out with the Altman brothers. A devout Christian, Carter wanted to bring a Christian moralism to politics. He wanted to make us a good nation. Yet Carter's presidency started falling apart almost immediately. He had all the same problems that Ford had and tackled them with public spending, printing more money, higher taxes. All of these things just made everything worse. All of these things resulted in a crushed American economy. And the result was that the economy completely stalled out, leading to stagflation, a unique economic situation with high unemployment, high inflation, and a stagnant economy. Whatever Carter's policies were, they completely fell apart with the twin oil shocks of the 1970s, and especially the oil shock of 1979. Carter's common man approach went over well with the boomers. It went over well with voters. But out in the world, this was seen as an opportunity. He was seen as weak and indecisive. And the U.S. military was still a wreck after Vietnam. The Soviets took full advantage, funding communist revolutionaries all across Latin America. By 1978, the Soviets were funding 8 major civil wars in Latin America, from Guatemala to Argentina. And in 1979, to prop up a failing communist government, Soviet Russia launches a direct military invasion of Afghanistan and takes complete and direct control over that nation. A furious Jimmy Carter upbraids the Soviets, and the Soviets ignore him. All right? And the scale of Carter's failure has become legendary in American politics. So much so that every time a Democratic president runs into trouble, people start calling him another Jimmy Carter. Do you really want to be another Jimmy Carter? And the scale of Carter's collapse led the boomers to seriously consider the unthinkable, voting for that guy, Law and Order Ronald Reagan. a former actor, the hippie-smashing ex-governor of California, the 1976 challenger to Gerald Ford. And of course, one of Reagan's great strengths was his wit and his humor, which he employed to great effect, and it won him the presidency. The election of 1980 was not even close. Carter was swept from the field. Quote unquote, I can't say it doesn't hurt. Reagan won something like 46 states, and he was elected by the boomers. The data is incontrovertible. Someone born between 1945 and 1950 would be 30 to 35 years old in 1980, a group that supported Reagan by 55%. The data is incontrovertible. Look at it. The baby boomers elected Ronald Reagan. Now, Reagan's presidency will be dubbed the Reagan Revolution, a term that Ronald Reagan himself only embraced at the very end of his presidency. Reagan himself preferred calling his presidency the rediscovery, a return to traditional American values. And in many ways, it was a return to the America of the 1950s, or at least an attempt to return to the America of the 1950s. And keep that in mind. Reagan gets elected to bring back the 1950s. And he's faced with this economic crisis. He's faced with this big kind of disco malaise of the 1970s. And when faced with the economic stagflation of the 1970s, Reagan embraces Calvin Coolidge's old economic methods. Supply side economics. This idea that tax cuts will spur economic prosperity and thus fuel job creation. Ronald Reagan calls it Reaganomics. Everyone else calls it ridiculous, unrealistic, and silly. Voodoo economics, trickle down economics. People doubted his ability to put this plan into action. They said, Ronald, you don't have the public support, you don't have popular sympathy. And then Reagan got both. He got both by being shot. 2 months into his presidency, Reagan is shot during an attempted assassination by a deranged fan of Jodie Foster. A ricochet off the presidential armored limousine misses Ronald Reagan's heart by less than an inch. This is followed by a wave of national sympathy and support. Reagan now has the political power to put his plan into action. With this public sympathy and popular support at his back, Reagan puts his economic policy into action. Reaganomics becomes governmental policy. Like Calvin Coolidge, Reagan slashes taxes down to 11%. He tightened the money supply. He slashed government spending. Everyone knew this was going to hit the American economy hard. Reagan was basically going to pop the clutch on the American economy. And he did. The entire American economy lurches forward. People can hear the gears grinding. The entire country wobbles back and forth. The entire American economy proceeded to stall out, resulting in a tight recession from 1981 to 1982. Unemployment surged to its highest level since the Great Depression, hit 11% during Ronald Reagan's very tight recession. Economic growth hit 0. The entire country stalls out. Reagan says, hold it, it will work. It will work. And it seems to work. Inflation, that old problem that had dogged every president since Richard Nixon, began to falter. But people said, it's not going to work, Reagan. What are you expecting the entire economic engine of the United States to just roar ahead? And Reagan said yes. And it did. It worked. After 1984, the economy began a period of explosive economic growth. 1984, the American economy hit 7.2% annual growth. Rates of growth unseen since the roaring 20s. Unemployment shrank. Inflation withered. This is the start of the Reagan expansion. This is 24 years of nearly uninterrupted economic growth, triggered by Ronald Reagan jump-starting the American economy in 1984. Despite massive federal debt, and we'll get into that in just a tick, Reaganomics seems to have worked. Ronald Reagan was the man of the year. And he delivered exactly what the boomers wanted him to. Pro-family, pro-growth. People could buy houses. People could get jobs. People could have kids. Mothers could stay at home if they wanted. People elected Reagan. The boomers elected Reagan to bring back the 1950s. And Reagan largely made good on that promise. But it was the 1950s with a twist, because things were different. And in 1984, not only did Ronald Reagan jumpstart the economy, but a new machine began to appear in many of these homes. These funny little electronic personal computers, the Macintosh and the Apple IIc. The personal computer was reaching people's homes, and they bought them. Enormously popular. Reagan prepares to run for re-election in 1984. And the only real issue that people have against Ronald Reagan is his age. If he runs for president in 1984, he would be 73 years old, making him one of the oldest American presidents in American history. So that's the only thing Reagan's got to deal with, the fact that, his age is an issue. And Reagan, of course, diffuses this with his wit and his humor by making a huge joke out of the whole thing.
One of my favorite quotations about age comes from Thomas Jefferson. He said that we should never judge a president by his age, only by his work. And ever since he told me that, I've stopped worrying. Just to show you how youthful I am, I intend to campaign in all 13 states.
The result isn't even close. Ronald Reagan sweeps 49 of 50 states in 1984, one of the largest landslides in American history, and indeed the last really big landslide we've had in American history. Reagan is overwhelmingly reelected. And this was the 1980s, the decade of materialism, the decade of greed is good. Wall Street stockbrokers were treated like rock stars. Excess was celebrated. Wealth was fashionable. In 1985, the top song was Madonna's Material Girl. Fashion became ordered and controlled. People showed off their wealth. Armani suits, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Rolex watches. People were celebrated not because they created great music or they painted great art or they wrote incredible books. People were celebrated because they made money. They made money hand over fist. This is the decade of the greed is good decade. And one of the products of this greed is good decade is Donald Trump, a billionaire real estate broker from New York. And if you ever wonder, why Trump is the way he is, it's because Donald Trump, a boomer, is a product of Reagan's 80s. And Reagan was elected to bring back the 1950s. And again, he largely succeeded. And this is shown in the entertainment of the time. One of the biggest films of the 1980s, Back to the Future, where they literally go back in time to the 1950s. One of the most popular television shows of the 1980s, Happy Days, a sort of sanitized, domesticated version of life in the 1950s. And it even includes taking Marlon Brando's dangerous Johnny from The Wild One and turning him into the domesticated, gelded, family-friendly Fonzie. Yeah, that's what Fonzie is. He's a gelded version of Marlon Brando. And the entertainment of the time celebrated soldiers and fighter pilots and hockey players and astronauts. Patriotism was in. This was the year of the yuppie, the young urban professional. All of the hippies shaved their beards, cut their hair, got rid of their tie-dyed, and put on suits and ties, went to work, and made money. The hippies became yuppies. And one of the better examples of a hippie who became a yuppie was Jerry Rubin. Jerry Rubin himself, one of the Chicago Seven, one of the troublemakers at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. There's Jerry Rubin in 1968. There's Jerry Rubin in 1984. He shaved, he cut his hair, he got rid of the tie-dyed hippie clothes and put on a suit and tie. Jerry Rubin became a venture capitalist. Jerry Rubin worked on Wall Street. Jerry Rubin became a prime financial backer of a little company called Apple Computers. Jerry Rubin became a multi-millionaire. And when people asked Jerry Rubin, weren't you this like big social revolutionary back in the 60s? Jerry Rubin said, sir, wealth creation is the real American Revolution. And there's even a better example of a hippie who became a yuppie than Jerry Rubin. Sonny Bono. And if you've never seen Sonny Bono before, here he is. He was married to Cher. And there's Sonny Bono in the 1960s, a sort of radical TV rock star. There's Sonny Bono in the 1970s, glitter and spandex, singing songs about sex, and drugs, and rock and roll. And then Sonny Bono hits the 80s. Sonny Bono gets rid of the spandex, gets rid of the tie-dye, puts on a suit and tie. Sonny Bono becomes a businessman. Sonny Bono becomes a politician. Sonny Bono becomes a Republican. Sonny Bono gets elected to Congress. Sonny Bono becomes good pals with Ronald Reagan. So from 60s radical hippie to conservative Republican in the 1980s. In fact, he becomes known as the congressman from Disney because Disney contributes all this money to him, and he basically does whatever Disney told him to. And in terms of the popular culture, the surviving Beatles began to license their songs for commercials. You know, the old song, You Say You Want a Revolution, that's used to sell sneakers, Nike sneakers. Come Together, the old song about Timothy Leary's campaign, it was used to advertise restaurants, Hard Rock Cafe. And people approached the Beatles and like, you guys used to sing about like social revolution and doing drugs and dropping out with Timothy Leary. Aren't you kind of selling out? And Paul McCartney, one of the Beatles, said, he has this great quote right up above me. I don't see it as a sellout, and I think anyone who does ought to go live in Russia. Because, you know, this is a capitalist country. People work for money. But not everybody could be considered a sellout. Not everybody shaved and put on a suit and tie and went to work on Wall Street or sold their revolutionary songs for TV commercials. And one of the people who never changed and never backed down was Abbie Hoffman. Remember Abbie Hoffman's Steal This Book? The very famous book where he wrote, Make War on Machines, and in particular the sterile machines of corporate death and the robots that guard them. In fact, bookstores refused to carry Abbie Hoffman's book because so many people stole it. And this is Abbie Hoffman in the 1980s, the social revolutionary who never backed down. He never stopped making war on the sterile machines of corporate death. But every time Abbie Hoffman organized protests, the protests were a little smaller. The press coverage was a little smaller. He wasn't making headline news. He would be mentioned on page 25 of the San Francisco Gazette. Money was tight. And all of his old friends were making millions on Wall Street. All of his old radical friends like Jerry Rubin were investing in Apple computers and wearing suits and ties. And Abbie Hoffman is like, this is not what we were supposed to do. This is not what we set out to do in the 1960s. We were supposed to make war on the sterile machines of corporate death. Not take control of the sterile machines of corporate death, not take control of these corporate machines and use them to make money. And Abbie Hoffman goes, I don't want to live in a world where the sterile machines of corporations won. And so he doesn't. And in 1989, Abbie Hoffman kills himself. All right. He died in 1989. a radical to the end. Now, this raises a really good question. It's a good discussion question. Are the boomers just massive, massive hypocrites? Who's right? Abby Hoffman or Paul McCartney? Did they sell out everything they stood for? Or did they grow up and realize they live in a material world? And why do you think they embraced in the 1980s what they tried to demolish in the 1960s? Cogitate on this and see if you can come up with an answer for it. But we're not done with the hypocrisy. The boomers elected Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan becomes president. And then Ronald Reagan launches a massive anti-drug campaign by his wife. There's Nancy Reagan. Just say no. If anybody asks you to do drugs, just say no. It's a huge campaign. It's well funded. Celebrities attend. It's a complete and total failure. But Reagan had more problems than just a failed anti-drug campaign. Chief among them was his foil, right up above my head, Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill was every bit the equal of Ronald Reagan. O'Neill was the Speaker of the House, the leader of Congress, and had ruled over Congress like an old political boss from the Gilded Age. O'Neill frustrated Ronald Reagan's attempt to cut spending at every opportunity. Tip O'Neill saw it as his duty to guard the legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to preserve parts of the Great Society and most of the New Deal from Ronald Reagan. So Reagan could cut taxes, but Tip O'Neill, determined to save the New Deal, prevented him from cutting spending. The result was massive, massive debt. Massive government debt, starting the trend of perpetual government indebtedness, and has placed the United States on the path of what looks like at this point, inevitable bankruptcy. And all of this massive federal debt starts with Ronald Reagan. And then came a pair of epidemics. The first was the crack epidemic. Mixing low-quality cocaine with baking soda and ammonia produced a highly effective, highly addictive, highly profitable drug. The epidemic demolished African American communities from New York to LA and drove out the remaining black middle class from the big cities. The crack epidemic gave money and power to violent street gangs. The police response to the crack epidemic was as brutal as it was ineffective. They didn't say no. And the effects of the crack epidemic polished off those old African American communities in Harlem or Watts or South Detroit. It drove out the last of the African American middle class. There are photographs of Harlem in the 1950s. It is a majority middle class neighborhood. And there's Harlem in the 1980s, a burned out ghetto infested with crackheads. And these African American communities never really recovered from the crack epidemic. And Ronald Reagan largely did nothing. He largely did nothing. And then came AIDS. With its seeds planted in the 1960s and 70s, the disease blossomed in the 1980s. It spread rapidly among homosexual men, IV drug users, and people with blood transfusions. It shut down the immune system, and people died from a host of secondary infections. AIDS is a slow, horrible, and public way to die. It will kill 700,000 Americans. There is no cure to AIDS, and in the 1980s, there was not even a treatment. During the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, to be diagnosed with AIDS was largely a death sentence. And the ugly and public manner of death triggered a great deal of sympathy from the American people. And it triggered a great deal of sympathy from boomers in particular. And boomers changed their opinion of homosexuality largely as a result of the AIDS crisis. And in many ways, AIDS normalized homosexuality in American society. As people witnessed the enormous suffering of friends and family. And it was such a horrible and such a public way to die. I mean, you have to have a heart made out of stone not to feel something as these families saw, their sons die of this horrible, horrible disease. Reagan, do something. And Reagan largely did nothing. All right. And these are the criticisms leveled against Ronald Reagan. And there are criticisms leveled against Ronald Reagan. And many people say, Ronald Reagan's failure to respond during these two horrible epidemics, crack on one hand and AIDS on the other, these remove him from consideration from being a really good president. Why didn't he do anything? Why didn't he do more? And part of it is they want to paint him as this cruel, person who didn't care. But part of it might just be because of his ideology of government, how he thought a president should react. Remember, Ronald Reagan idolized Calvin Coolidge. And Calvin Coolidge basically said, these problems are not the responsibility of the federal government. And that's what Reagan said. If there's a horrible drug epidemic in New York, that's New York's problem. If there's a massive AIDS epidemic in the Bay Area, that's California's problem. It's not the federal government's problem. Now, one responsibility that is the federal government's problem is defense. Reagan decides to fix the U.S. military. Reagan spends a tremendous amount of money rebuilding the U.S. military. He spends almost as much money rebuilding the U.S. military as LBJ did during the entirety of the Vietnam War. And all of that money was borrowed. Reagan builds new weapons, new ships, new airplanes. He builds entire new army regiments. And including, I think, the best battle dress uniform. That's the best American soldiers ever looked, right there. Right there. All right. And most of what we think of as the U.S. military today comes from Ronald Reagan's huge military buildup in the 1980s. Reagan called it peace through strength. He repaired most of the damage from Vietnam, aiming for a fully professional, all-volunteer military with the latest high-tech equipment, including new bombers, deployment of new missiles, a 600-ship U.S. Navy. Pushes the U.S. Navy to the size that hasn't been seen since World War II. He even brings back the old battleships. The old battleships of World War II sail for the last and final time under the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Now, in the 1970s, the Soviets had backed 8 major civil wars across Latin America. And what the Soviets were trying to do is bait the Americans into fighting a second Vietnam War in the 1980s. The Russians want us to fight a second Vietnam in the jungles of Central America. Reagan resisted active military involvement, opting to back military and democratic governments across the region, supplying Americans only as pilots or support. And he sent a lot of money, he sent a lot of weapons, and he sent a lot of training to Latin America. All of that money was borrowed. But this meant that the U.S. was going to support some of the most brutal military dictators Latin America had ever seen, from Rios Montt to Augusto Pinochet. These were brutal men by any measure, men who murdered and disappeared hundreds of thousands of their own people. And there is Latin American soldiers arresting 12-year-olds, the children of suspected communists. One of the bylines of this policy was that apparently Americans didn't care about atrocities as long as it wasn't committed by Americans. But it worked. I mean, it worked. All right. Communist guerrillas were rolled back across Latin America. There were 8 major civil wars the communists were fighting. Communists lost every single one of them. And there was no Vietnam 2.0. At least, not for the Americans. Remember, the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979, so Ronald Reagan and the CIA proceed to back fanatical anti-communist Muslims. And the Americans turn Afghanistan into Russia's Vietnam. For the next 10 years, the Soviets were bogged down in an unwinnable war in the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan, as the Afghani guerrillas demolished Russian regiment after Russian regiment after Russian regiment. And just like Vietnam, the Russians found themselves locked in an unwinnable stalemate. By 1989, the Russian army was in tatters, disintegrating in the field and on the verge of collapse. The Soviets withdrew in 1989, firmly defeated by the American-backed Muslim guerrillas of Afghanistan. The Red Army would never recover from its defeat in Afghanistan. In fact, the entire Soviet economy was collapsing. Decades of central planning had resulted in a grossly inefficient economy where shortages and poor quality were commonplace. In the 1980s, Russia struggled with basic services, while the American economy was just booming. The long-predicted economic collapse of the communist system was nearing. And as Soviet Russia's economy was falling apart, they struggled to match Reagan's military buildup. For a while, the Soviets tried to match America tank for tank, ship for ship, missile for missile, and they couldn't do it. Reagan outspent the Russians. And especially given the collapse of world oil prices and the faltering Russian economy, there was simply no way the Russians could keep up with the Americans militarily. And then Reagan embarrassed them technologically. Reagan built an entire fleet of these fantastic spaceships, the space shuttles, and sent them into space, delivering payload, building these elaborate space stations. Mission after mission of the space shuttle goes up into space. And the Russians have nothing like this. The Russians can't even build anything like the space shuttle. But it wasn't for lack of trying. The Russians tried to build their own space shuttle. They built 2 of them, and they were both terrible, dangerous pieces of junk. And here is the, frankly, pathetic attempt of the Russians to build, to mimic this technological advancement of the Americans. And they just couldn't do it. They just couldn't do it. I don't think only one of the Russian space shuttles flew once unmanned, and it like almost exploded. The Russians are hopelessly economically, militarily, and technologically behind the Americans. And then Reagan doubles down. Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a plan to build a system of space-based missile interceptors, to build a missile shield to protect the United States for all times. Critics derided the project. They mocked it. They're like, oh, it's the Star Wars program. Ronald Reagan wants to build Star Wars. Ronald Reagan was like, yeah, I want to build Star Wars. Remember, he was an actor. Reagan loved the name. He embraced the name Star Wars. And this Star Wars was crazy stuff. It was going to be space lasers and orbital interceptors piloted by astronaut fighter pilots. Could it actually be done? No, it was crazy plans. And the Americans knew we couldn't do it. But the Russians didn't. The Soviet Union believed Reagan was going to build all of this stuff. The only thing the Russians had left were nuclear missiles, and Reagan was going to make them all obsolete. The Russians scrambled to duplicate the American system and completely failed to do it. Fear of American space-based weapons and the Reagan military buildup forced the Russians to start negotiating with the Americans. The Russians began to talk about ending the Cold War, opening up their country. But it was too little, too late. The Red Army was falling apart. The Soviet Empire was bankrupt. No one was afraid of communists anymore. 3 years after Ronald Reagan leaves office, the entire Soviet Union disintegrated, the different parts breaking away and declaring independence. The Soviet Empire was dead, destroyed by its own people. And here we have people, this is from Germany, where the German people spontaneously rose up, threw off communism, and tore down the Berlin Wall with their bare hands. And this was repeated in country after country after country. And communism disintegrated. The Cold War was over. And even though he wasn't president at the time, Ronald Reagan has gotten the lion's share of the credit. Everyone says Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. And he pretty much did. It's a hard case to argue that Ronald Reagan didn't win the Cold War. Now, Ronald Reagan leaves office in 1988, a beloved and controversial president. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, is elected, largely because Reagan told America to vote for George H.W. Bush. And Ronald Reagan accomplishes one of the few hat tricks in American politics. It's a mark of a successful president that you can get your own successor elected president. In the last 100 years, that's only happened 3 times. Calvin Coolidge did it. FDR did it. Ronald Reagan did it. But was there a Reagan Revolution? I mean, Reagan certainly changed the nation. Boomers elected him to restore 1950s America, and he largely did it. Historians generally dub his presidency the Reagan Reconciliation, as he unified the old social divisions of the 1960s and 70s. He unified the old counterculture versus the not-so-silent majority. And he did this by largely ignoring the social transformation of the 1960s. Reagan largely avoided the hot-button culture wars of the 1970s. From liberalized sex to abortion to civil rights to feminism, Reagan just kind of ignored it, all right? Reagan just delivered decades of economic growth. He delivered a strong military. He delivered a patriotic nation. But he also contributed to many of the problems we have in the 21st century. But criticism of Reagan at the time was muted. And it was muted because the old man got sick. He got really sick. There was Reagan's very visible decline in the 1990s as his mind slowly faded from Alzheimer's disease. And as Reagan, lost his mind and got sicker and sicker, this absolutely blunted criticism of the old president. It added to his myth. People in the 1990s would point out these problems from Reagan, and people would go, "How are you criticizing our dear old man? He won the Cold War. Why do you hate old people?" And, the fact that he got so sick in the 1990s kind of cemented the myth of Reagan, the great communicator, the Reagan Revolution. And Ronald Reagan died in 2004, and here are the images from his state funeral. But by the time of his death, the problems from Reagan's presidency had come to full fruition. And this would become incredibly apparent during the Great Recession, which will be the topic of our discussion next time. And I will see you there.